The lunch rush at Tony's Italian kitchen was finally dying down. David sat alone at his usual corner booth, the one by the window where he could watch the street outside while he ate. He was scrolling through his phone, barely paying attention to the half-eaten plate of pasta in front of him. It had been one of those mornings. Back-to-back meetings, a project deadline moved up by a week, and his boss asking for revisions on something he'd already revised 3 times. David worked as a software developer for a tech company downtown, and lately work felt like it was swallowing his whole life. He couldn't even remember the last time he actually tasted his food instead of just mechanically chewing, while his mind raced through code and deadlines. He glanced at his watch. 12:45. He needed to be back at the office by 1:30. The pasta was good, but he'd ordered too much. Again. His eyes were always bigger than his stomach at this place. The smell of garlic bread and marinara sauce filled the air as servers rushed past his table, clearing dishes and wiping down surfaces. David flagged down his regular waiter and asked for a to-go box. Maybe he'd eat the rest for dinner. Maybe it would sit in his office fridge for 3 days until he threw it away. Either way, he wasn't going to finish it now. As he waited, he noticed someone standing near his table, not right next to him, but close enough that he could see her in his peripheral vision. At first, he thought she might be waiting for the table, but when he looked up, he realized she was looking at him. Or more specifically, looking at his food. She was probably in her late 30s, though it was hard to tell. Her face had that weathered look that comes from spending too much time in the sun, or maybe from worry. She wore a gray jacket that looked too warm for the weather, and her jeans had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and there was a nervous energy about her, like she was trying to decide whether to speak or just walk away. David's first instinct was to look back down at his phone. He'd lived in the city long enough to develop that automatic response. Don't make eye contact. Don't engage. Keep moving. It wasn't that he was a bad person. It was just easier that way. But something made him pause. Maybe it was the way she was standing there, not aggressive or pushy, just quiet. Or maybe it was the fact that she looked embarrassed, like whatever she was about to do was costing her something. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and he could see her fingers fidgeting. She cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I'm really sorry to bother you." David looked up at her fully now. Up close, he could see the tiredness in her eyes, the kind that doesn't come from one bad night of sleep, but from weeks or months of them strung together. "I don't mean to intrude on your lunch," she continued, speaking a little faster now, as if she wanted to get the words out before she lost her nerve. "But I noticed you weren't going to finish that, and I was wondering, would you mind if I had it? What you're not eating, I mean." David just stared at her for a moment, processing what she'd just asked. In all his years of eating at restaurants in the city, he'd been asked for money plenty of times. He'd been handed flyers, asked to sign petitions, even had someone try to sell him a watch once. But he'd never had anyone ask for his leftover food. There was something about it that caught him off guard, something honest. She wasn't making up a story about needing bus fare or gas money. She was just hungry and she was asking for food. "I haven't eaten since yesterday morning," she added, and there was no self-pity in her voice. Just a fact. "I know it's strange to ask, but I saw you boxing it up and I thought maybe you wouldn't mind." The waiter arrived at that moment with the to-go container, setting it down on the table with a practiced smile before hurrying off to another table. David looked at the box, then back at the woman standing in front of him. She had this look on her face that he recognized even though he couldn't quite place where from. It was pride mixed with necessity. The look of someone who didn't want to ask for help but had run out of other options. Someone who was probably dying inside having to do this but doing it anyway because they had no choice. "Yeah," David heard himself say. "Yeah, of course, here." He pushed the container toward her along with the unused napkin and fork the waiter had brought. But as he did, something made him look at her face more carefully. Really look at it. There was something familiar about her, something in the shape of her eyes, the way her mouth curved slightly even when she wasn't smiling. It nagged at the back of his mind like a song he couldn't quite remember the words to. The woman's hand was reaching for the container when she glanced up and met his eyes. For just a second, they looked at each other directly. And in that second, David felt his stomach drop. He knew those eyes, he knew that face. It had been years. More than 20 years, actually. But suddenly he was 12 years old again, sitting in a classroom with posters of the solar system on the walls and a periodic table by the door. He could smell the distinct scent of dry erase markers and old textbooks. He could hear the afternoon announcements crackling over the intercom, and he could see her standing at the front of the room, younger and smiling, holding up a book and asking the class who wanted to read the next chapter out loud. "Ms. Patterson?" The words came out before he could stop them. The woman froze. Her hand was still stretched out toward the food container, but she'd gone completely still. Her eyes widened and he watched the color drain from her face. "Ms. Patricia Patterson?" he said again, his voice barely above a whisper now. She was staring at him like she'd seen a ghost. Her mouth opened, then closed. She took a small step back. Do I know you?" she asked. But there was something in her voice that said she was starting to recognize him too. David's mind was racing. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Ms. Patterson had been his 6th grade teacher at Lincoln Elementary School. She'd been the one who stayed after school twice a week to help him with reading, because he was so far behind. She'd been the one who bought him his first real chapter book with her own money, when she found out his family couldn't afford any. She'd been the one who told his parents through a translator that their son was smart, that he just needed some extra help, that he could do great things. She'd changed his entire life. And now she was standing in a restaurant, asking him for his leftover pasta because she hadn't eaten in a day. David stood up from his chair so fast he almost knocked over his water glass. His heart was pounding in his chest. "Ms. Patterson, it's me, David Chen. I was in your class in 2002. You taught 6th grade at Lincoln Elementary." He watched her face carefully, saw the exact moment recognition hit her. Her hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears. "David?" she whispered. "Little David Chen?" They stood there in the middle of the restaurant, the lunch crowd noise fading into the background. Two people who hadn't seen each other in over 2 decades, brought back together by chance in the most unlikely way possible. David looked at his old teacher, the woman who had believed in him when no one else did, the woman who had seen potential in a struggling immigrant kid who could barely read English, the woman who had spent her own time and money to make sure he didn't fall through the cracks, and she was asking him for his leftovers. For a long moment, neither of them could speak. They just stood there, staring at each other like they were both trying to convince themselves this was real. The restaurant continued buzzing around them. Plates clattered in the kitchen. People laughed at nearby tables. But in that corner booth by the window, time seemed to have stopped completely. Miss Patterson's hand was still covering her mouth, and David could see tears forming in her eyes. She looked completely shocked, like someone had just told her the sky was green instead of blue. "I can't believe it," she finally said, her voice shaking. "I can't believe it's really you." David didn't know what to do with his hands. He shoved them in his pockets, then took them out again. His mind was going a million miles an hour, trying to process what was happening. This woman had been such a huge part of his childhood, and then she'd just been gone. He'd moved on to middle school, then high school, then college. Life had happened. He'd thought about her sometimes over the years, wondered where she'd ended up, hoped she was doing well, but he never imagined this. "Please," he said quickly, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Please sit down." She hesitated, glancing at the food container on the table, then back at him. He could see the embarrassment on her face, the shame of being caught in this situation by someone who once looked up to her. "David, I should go. This is too awkward. I'm so sorry you had to see me like this." "No," David said firmly. "Please don't go. Just sit. Please." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because after another moment of hesitation, she slowly slid into the booth across from him. She kept her jacket on even though it was warm in the restaurant, and her hands disappeared into her sleeves like she was trying to make herself smaller. David sat back down, his heart still racing. He couldn't stop looking at her face, trying to match the woman in front of him with the teacher he remembered. She was older, obviously. They both were. But it was more than that. She looked tired in a way that went deeper than just needing sleep. There were lines around her eyes and mouth that hadn't been there before. Her hair, which he remembered as always perfectly styled, was streaked with gray and pulled back carelessly. But those eyes were the same. Kind eyes. The kind that had looked at a struggling kid and seen something worth saving. "I'm going to order you some food," David said, already raising his hand to flag down the waiter. A real meal, not leftovers. David, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. He caught the waiter's attention and quickly ordered the chicken parmesan with a side salad and a glass of water. When the waiter left, David turned back to Ms. Patterson. When was the last time you ate? Really ate? She looked down at her hands. Yesterday morning. There's a church 2 blocks from here that serves breakfast on Tuesdays. I had some eggs and toast. David felt like someone had punched him in the chest. And before that? Monday evening. The food bank on 5th Street. He had to look away for a second. He stared out the window at the people walking by, living their normal lives, completely unaware that inside this restaurant his whole world was shifting. What happened? He asked quietly. How did you? I mean, you were a teacher. You had a good job. What happened? Ms. Patterson was quiet for a long time. David was about to tell her she didn't have to explain when she started speaking, her voice so soft he had to lean forward to hear her. Life happened, she said simply. A lot of life all at once. The waiter brought her water and she drank half the glass in one go, like she'd been wandering in a desert. David waited, giving her time. My husband died 5 years ago, she continued, setting the glass down carefully. Tom. Did you ever meet Tom? No, you wouldn't have. We got married the summer after you were in my class. A sad smile crossed her face. He had a heart attack at work, just dropped dead at his desk. He was only 48 years old. I'm so sorry, David said, and the words felt completely inadequate. The medical bills were devastating. The ambulance, the emergency room, the attempts to revive him. Even though he died, we still got billed for everything. Our insurance didn't cover it all. I had to take out a second mortgage on the house just to pay the hospitals. She took another sip of water and David noticed her hand was shaking slightly. I kept teaching. I loved teaching. It was the only thing that kept me going, honestly. But then I started getting sick. My hands would shake, and I'd drop things. I'd lose my balance. At first I thought it was just stress, you know. Grief does strange things to your body. The waiter arrived with her food, setting down a steaming plate of chicken parmesan that smelled incredible. Ms. Patterson stared at it like she couldn't quite believe it was real. She picked up her fork, but her hand was trembling so badly she had to set it down again. David pretended not to notice, looking out the window to give her a moment to compose herself. Eventually I went to a doctor, she continued. They ran tests, lots of tests, and then they told me I have Parkinson's disease, early onset. I'm only 43 years old and I have Parkinson's. Oh God, David breathed. The medication helps, but it's expensive, and I started having trouble at work. I'd be writing on the board and my hand would freeze up. I dropped a stack of papers once and couldn't pick them up because my fingers wouldn't work right. The kids were sweet about it, but the administration... She trailed off, shaking her head. Budget cuts were coming. They needed to reduce staff. When you have a teacher with a disability who might need accommodations, well, it's easier to let them go. They can't do that. That's illegal. They didn't fire me because of the Parkinson's. Officially. They eliminated my position due to budget constraints. Happens all the time. The bitterness in her voice was clear. 23 years of teaching, and they gave me a month's severance and a thank you card. She finally managed to cut a piece of the chicken and brought it to her mouth. David watched as she closed her eyes, savoring that first bite like it was the best thing she'd ever tasted. It probably was, after not eating for more than a day. Without the job, I lost my health insurance, she continued between bites. She was eating slowly, deliberately, like she knew she needed to pace herself even though she was starving. The medication cost $800 a month without insurance. I had to choose between medicine and mortgage payments. I chose medicine. Then I had to choose between medicine and keeping the electricity on. Then medicine and food. Where are your kids? David asked, remembering she'd once shown the class pictures of her children. Can't they help? They don't know how bad it is, she admitted. Tyler is in Seattle trying to make it as a musician. He's barely scraping by himself. And Rachel just had her second baby. Her husband lost his job last year. They've got their own problems. I don't want to burden them with mine. David felt anger rising in his chest. Not at her kids, but at the whole impossible situation. At a system that could let someone fall so far so fast. "I lost the house about 4 months ago," Ms. Patterson said, her voice matter-of-fact now, like she was reading a grocery list. "I've been staying in my car. It's a 2006 Honda. The passenger door doesn't lock anymore, but it runs. That's what matters." "You're living in your car?" David's voice came out louder than he intended, and a couple at the next table glanced over. She nodded, taking another bite of food. "There's a parking lot behind the library where security doesn't bother people as much. I usually park there at night. During the day, I try to find odd jobs, cash work, day labor, whatever I can get." David sat back in his seat, his mind reeling. This was Ms. Patterson, the woman who had spent her own money on school supplies for kids whose parents couldn't afford them. The woman who had stayed late every Tuesday and Thursday for a whole school year to help him learn to read better. The woman who had written him a letter of recommendation for the advanced program that changed his entire academic trajectory. She had saved his life in so many ways, and here she was, living in a car and asking strangers for their leftovers. "I'm sorry you had to see me like this," she said quietly, setting down her fork. "I know this must be so uncomfortable for you. You probably have to get back to work. I should—" "No," David interrupted. "You're not going anywhere. Not yet. We need to figure this out." She looked at him with those same kind eyes, but now there was confusion in them too. "Figure what out?" "This. All of this. You helped me when I needed it most. Now it's my turn." "David, that was different. You were a child. I was your teacher. That was my job." "No," he said firmly. "You went way beyond your job. You saw a kid who was falling through the cracks and you caught him. You didn't have to do any of what you did, but you did it anyway." Tears were rolling down her cheeks now, though she tried to wipe them away quickly. "I don't expect anything from you," she whispered. I was so hungry and I saw you had extra food and I thought maybe. I never imagined it would be you." David leaned forward, looking directly into her eyes. "Do you remember what you told me on the last day of 6th grade?" She shook her head slowly. "You said I was going to do extraordinary things. You said I was special and that one day I'd help a lot of people." His voice cracked a little. "Well, maybe this is that day. Maybe I get to start by helping you." David didn't go back to work that afternoon. He called his boss and said he had a family emergency, which wasn't really a lie. Ms. Patterson had been family to him in the ways that mattered most, even if they didn't share blood. Instead, he sat in that restaurant booth for another hour while Ms. Patterson finished her meal. They talked about everything and nothing. She asked about his life, and he told her about finishing college, getting his degree in computer science, landing his job at the tech company. He told her about his parents, how they'd moved to a nicer neighborhood, how his younger sister had just graduated from medical school. "I knew you'd do well," she said, and there was genuine happiness in her tired eyes. "Even back then I could see it. You were so determined, so focused once you understood something." "That was because of you," David insisted. "I was failing. I couldn't read half the words in our textbooks. My parents didn't speak enough English to help me with homework. I was going to get held back." "But you didn't get held back. You worked harder than any student I'd ever seen. Because you made me believe I could do it." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and David's mind was racing with plans. He couldn't just give her some money and walk away. That wouldn't fix anything. She needed real help. Sustainable help. "Okay," he said finally, pulling out his phone. "Here's what we're going to do. First, you're not sleeping in your car tonight. David, no arguments. There's a hotel 3 blocks from here. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and safe. I'm getting you a room for the week while we figure out the next steps." Ms. Patterson's eyes widened. "David, I can't accept that. Do you know how much a hotel costs for a week? Do you know how much you spent on me over that school year? The tutoring sessions, the books, the supplies you bought because you knew my family couldn't afford them." He pulled up a hotel booking app on his phone. "You never asked for anything back, you just helped because you cared. Let me do the same." She opened her mouth to protest again, but David held up his hand. Please, I make good money. Really good money. More than I know what to do with most of the time. Let me use it for something that actually matters. He could see her struggling with it, pride warring with desperation. Finally, she nodded, tears streaming down her face again. Just for a few days, she whispered, until I can figure something out. For a week, David corrected gently, and we're going to figure something out together. An hour later, David was sitting on the bed in room 214 of the Riverside Hotel, while Miss Patterson stood by the window, looking out at the city like she couldn't quite believe she was there. He'd stopped at a drugstore on the way and bought her some basic necessities. Toothbrush, toothpaste, shampoo, soap. Things most people took for granted, but that became luxuries when you were living in a car. There's a washer and dryer on each floor, he told her, and the woman at the front desk said continental breakfast starts at 6:30. Miss Patterson turned to look at him, and for the first time since he'd recognized her in the restaurant, she actually smiled. Not a sad smile or a grateful smile, but a real one that reached her eyes. You know what I'm most excited about? She said. A hot shower. A real shower where I don't have to time myself because I'm in a gym locker room hoping no one asks questions. David felt that punch to his chest again. He couldn't imagine it. Living that way day after day with no end in sight. Take all the time you want, he said. The hot water won't run out. After he left the hotel, David sat in his car for a long time just thinking. He was supposed to feel good about what he'd done, right? He'd helped someone in need. He'd repaid a debt that had been weighing on his conscience for years, even if he hadn't realized it until today. But instead, he felt angry. Angry at a world where someone like Miss Patterson could fall so far. Angry at a school system that would abandon a 23-year veteran teacher when she got sick. Angry at himself for not somehow knowing she needed help sooner. He pulled out his phone and started making calls. The first call was to his old friend Kevin, who worked in human resources at his company. They'd gone to college together, and Kevin owed him a favor from when David had helped him debug a system issue that would have gotten him fired. Hey man, weird question, David said when Kevin picked up. Does the company have any programs for hiring people with disabilities? Like accommodations and support services?
Yeah, actually.
We've been trying to expand our diversity initiatives. Why? David explained the situation, carefully leaving out some of the more personal details. Kevin listened quietly. So she has teaching experience in Parkinson's? Kevin asked when David finished. 23 years in education. And yes, early onset Parkinson's, but she's on medication. She just needs a job that can work with her condition. Tell you what, Kevin said. We're actually looking for someone to help coordinate our educational outreach program. We partner with schools to teach kids about technology and coding. It's not classroom teaching exactly, but it involves curriculum development, working with educators, that kind of thing. The role is pretty flexible and we have excellent health insurance. David sat up straighter in his seat. Seriously? Send me her information. I can't promise anything, but I'll see what I can do. If she's as good as you say she is, she might be exactly what we need. The second call was harder. David scrolled through his phone contacts until he found Dr. Lisa Wu, a neurologist he'd met at a company charity event 6 months ago. They'd talked about her work with Parkinson's patients, and she'd given him her card. Told him to reach out if he ever wanted to discuss her research. He'd never imagined he'd be calling her like this. Dr. Wu listened to his explanation with professional calm. Without examining her, I can't say much, she said. But if she's been without consistent medical care and medication, that's a serious problem. Parkinson's is progressive. The earlier we intervene with proper treatment, the better the outcomes. Could you see her? David asked. I'll pay for it. Whatever it costs. Let me check my schedule. There was a pause while she looked something up. I have a cancellation tomorrow at 2. If she can come in, then I'll do a consultation. And David? Don't worry about the cost right now. Let's just get her in and see what we're dealing with. That night, David barely slept. He lay in his comfortable bed, in his comfortable apartment, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Ms. Patterson 3 miles away in that hotel room. He wondered if she was actually sleeping or if she was lying awake too, overwhelmed by the sudden change in her circumstances. He thought about 6th grade, about being that scared kid who couldn't understand why English had to be so complicated. He remembered the frustration of looking at a page of text and having it feel like a foreign code he'd never crack. He remembered his parents' worry, their fear that their son would never succeed in this new country. And he remembered Ms. Patterson's patience. The way she'd break down each word, each concept, never making him feel stupid even when he asked the same questions over and over. The way she'd celebrated every small victory like it was a major triumph. The way she'd believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. She'd given him the tools to build a life. Now he had the chance to help her rebuild hers. The next morning, David called in sick to work. He picked Ms. Patterson up from the hotel at 9. She looked different already. Cleaner, more rested, though still wearing the same clothes from yesterday. "First stop, Target," he announced as she got in the car. "David, you've already done so much. You need clothes, and probably about 100 other things. Let me do this, please." They spent 2 hours at Target, and David watched as Ms. Patterson hesitantly picked out basic necessities, a few outfits, underwear and socks, a winter coat because hers was falling apart. He kept encouraging her to get more, but she was so careful with every choice, constantly checking price tags and trying to pick the cheapest options. At the checkout, she turned to him. "I'm going to pay you back for all of this, every cent. Once I get back on my feet, I promise." "The only thing I want you to promise," David said, "is that you'll let me help without feeling guilty about it. You changed my life. This is the least I can do." The appointment with Dr. Wu was thorough and intense. David waited in the lobby, pacing back and forth, checking his phone, trying to distract himself with work emails he wasn't supposed to be looking at since he'd called in sick. When they finally came out, Ms. Patterson looked exhausted, but Dr. Wu was smiling. "The good news is that we caught you," Dr. Wu said. "You're not as far progressed as you could be, and with proper medication and treatment, we can significantly slow this down. The bad news is you've been undertreated for too long. We need to adjust your medications immediately." "I can't afford," Ms. Patterson started. "I work with a foundation that helps patients who can't afford their medications," Dr. Wu interrupted gently. "I'm going to get you enrolled. It'll take a few weeks to process, but in the meantime, I'm giving you samples to start the new treatment protocol today." In the car afterward, Ms. Patterson was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked softly. "Really? I was your teacher for 1 year more than 20 years ago. You don't owe me this." David pulled over to the side of the road and turned to look at her. "You're right," he said. "I don't owe you this, but you gave me something I can never repay. You gave me hope when I had none. You saw potential in me when everyone else just saw a struggling immigrant kid. You didn't have to do any of that. But you did. Not because you owed me anything, but because you cared." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe that's what this is really about. Not paying back a debt, just caring. The way you taught me to care." David couldn't stop thinking about other students. Ms. Patterson had taught for 23 years. That was hundreds, maybe thousands of kids who had passed through her classroom. How many of them had stories like his? How many of them had she helped in ways big and small? The idea came to him on a Thursday night, exactly 1 week after he'd found her in the restaurant. He was lying in bed scrolling through social media when he came across a post from someone he'd gone to elementary school with. They were friends online but hadn't actually spoken in years. What if he could find more of them? More of Ms. Patterson's former students? He sat up and opened his laptop. Lincoln Elementary School had a Facebook group for alumni. He'd joined it years ago but never really paid attention to it. Now he scrolled through the member list, looking for familiar names, people he'd gone to school with, people who might remember Ms. Patterson. He started sending messages. "Hey, this is random, but do you remember Ms. Patterson from 6th grade? I ran into her recently and wanted to get in touch with other students she taught. Let me know if you're interested in catching up." He sent out 20 messages that night, not really expecting much, but the responses started coming in almost immediately. "Oh my God, Ms. Patterson. Is she okay? I've thought about her so many times over the years. She was the best teacher I ever had. I would love to reconnect. Ms. Patterson literally saved my life. I'd love to hear how she's doing." By the weekend, David had responses from 15 people, and they all had stories. There was Jenny Rodriguez, now a nurse at Children's Hospital. She told David how Ms. Patterson had helped her family navigate the immigration system when they were about to be deported, how she'd connected them with a lawyer who worked pro bono and spent hours translating documents for them. There was Michael Brooks, who owned a small construction company. He explained how he'd had was wrong and fought with the school administration to get him tested and accommodated. There was Amy Lau, a social worker, who shared that Ms. Patterson had noticed bruises on her arms in 6th grade. She'd been the one to report the abuse, the one who'd stayed with Amy during the scary interviews with Child Protective Services. She'd probably saved Amy's life. Story after story poured in. Each one different, but all the same in the important ways. Ms. Patterson had seen kids who needed help, and she'd helped them. No fanfare, no recognition, just quiet, steady support given to children who needed it most. David sat at his kitchen table reading through the messages, and an idea started forming in his mind. A big idea. He called Kevin from HR first. "Remember that job interview you set up for Ms. Patterson?" David asked. "Yeah, she came in yesterday, actually. Absolutely crushed it. We're drawing up an offer letter now." David felt a wave of relief wash over him. Ms. Patterson had been so nervous about the interview, worried that her shaking hands would make a bad impression. He'd coached her through it, reminded her of everything she had to offer. "That's amazing," David said. "But I have another question. Does the company do matching donations? Like if I donate to a cause, would they match it? Up to $10,000 per employee per year. Why? I'm going to set up a fund for Ms. Patterson. Get her fully back on her feet. I was thinking we could get other former students involved too. If the company matches whatever we raise, that could really make a difference." "That's actually a really cool idea," Kevin said. "Send me the details and I'll talk to the community giving department. They might even want to feature this in the company newsletter." David's next call was to his friend Rachel, who worked in event planning. "I need your help organizing something," he told her. "A reunion dinner. About 20 people, somewhere nice but not too fancy. Can you help me put that together?" "Of course. When were you thinking?" 2 weeks from now." "And Rachel?" "It needs to be a surprise." Over the next 2 weeks, David barely slept. He was coordinating with former students, planning the dinner, setting up the fund, and checking in with Ms. Patterson every day. She'd been offered the job and had found a small apartment she could afford with her new salary. The relief in her voice when she'd called to tell him had made David want to cry. "I start in 2 weeks, she'd said. "David, I can't thank you enough. You gave me my life back." "You're going to do great," he told her. "They're lucky to have you." But he hadn't told her about the dinner. That was going to be the real surprise. The night finally arrived. David had told Ms. Patterson he wanted to take her out to celebrate her new job. Just the two of them, a nice dinner at an Italian place across town. She'd agreed, though she'd insisted it was too much, that he'd already done more than enough. Tony's Italian kitchen had a private room in the back that they used for special events. Rachel had helped David transform it into something beautiful. Soft lighting, simple flower arrangements on the tables, photos displayed on a board near the entrance, photos of Ms. Patterson's old classroom, pictures that former students had dug out of their parents' attics and basements. David arrived early while Rachel did a final check of everything. One by one, the former students arrived. Some he recognized immediately. Others had changed so much he had to check name tags. But they all had one thing in common. They were all excited, nervous, grateful for the chance to see the teacher who had changed their lives. Jenny the nurse arrived with her wife and 2 kids. Michael the contractor came straight from a job site, still in his work clothes. Amy the social worker brought flowers. There were teachers, engineers, artists, a firefighter, a chef, a police officer. All of them had been 6th graders once, sitting in Ms. Patterson's classroom, learning more than just math and reading. "Is everyone clear on the plan?" David asked as 7 o'clock approached. "When she walks in, we all just stay quiet for a second. Let her see us. Then we can all go crazy." Everyone nodded, grinning like kids planning a surprise party. David's phone buzzed. Ms. Patterson was 5 minutes away. His heart was pounding as he took his position by the door. He'd told the restaurant host to send her straight back to the private room. Rachel dimmed the lights slightly, and everyone found their spots around the tables. Then the door opened. Miss Patterson walked in wearing a new dress she'd bought for the occasion, her hair nicely styled, looking more like the teacher David remembered. She was smiling at something David had said, not paying attention to where they were going. Then she looked up and saw them. All 15 of her former students, standing there in this private room, all looking at her with love and gratitude written on their faces. Her hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes went wide. For a moment she just stood frozen in the doorway. "Surprise," David said softly. Then everyone started talking at once. People rushed forward to hug her. She was crying and half the room was crying with her. David stood back and watched, his own eyes wet, as his former teacher was surrounded by the lives she'd touched. "I don't understand," she kept saying. "What is this? What's happening?" "We wanted to see you," Jenny said, holding Ms. Patterson's hands. "David found us and told us everything. We couldn't let you go through that alone. You were there for all of us when we needed you," Michael added. "Now we want to be here for you." They moved to the tables, and over the next 3 hours, magic happened. Each person stood up and shared their story. What Ms. Patterson had meant to them, how she'd changed their trajectory, some of the stories she remembered. Others she'd completely forgotten, small acts of kindness that had seemed insignificant to her but had meant everything to a struggling child. Amy talked about the abuse investigation, how Ms. Patterson had bought her new clothes because hers were always dirty and torn, how she'd made sure Amy had lunch every day, quietly paying for it herself when Amy's parents forgot to send lunch money. Michael described how Ms. Patterson had spent her own money to buy him audiobooks and colored overlays to help with his dyslexia. How she'd stayed after school for months, teaching him strategies to work around his reading difficulties. Jenny's voice shook as she explained how Ms. Patterson had been the only adult who believed her family deserved to stay in the country. How she'd written letters and made phone calls and refused to give up until they found help. By the time everyone had shared, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Then David stood up. He'd prepared a speech, but suddenly, all his carefully chosen words seemed inadequate. "Ms. Patterson," he began, "every person in this room is here because you saw something in us that we couldn't see in ourselves. You didn't just teach us reading and math. You taught us that we mattered, that we were worth the extra time and effort, that we could be more than our circumstances." He paused, looking around at all the faces, successful, happy people who had once been struggling kids. "So we decided to do something," he continued. "We've set up a fund. All of us contributed what we could, and my company matched it. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to make sure you never have to ask anyone for their leftovers again. It's enough to make sure you have a cushion while you get back on your feet. It's enough to say thank you." He handed her an envelope. Inside was a check that represented contributions from 15 former students, matched by his company's giving program. It wasn't $1 million, but it was enough to change everything. Ms. Patterson opened the envelope with shaking hands. When she saw the amount, she actually gasped. "I can't accept this," she whispered. "This is too much." "You don't get to decide that," Amy said gently. "You never let us refuse your help. Now you don't get to refuse ours." "You gave us everything you had," Jenny added. "Let us give something back." Ms. Patterson looked around the room at all these faces. These children who weren't children anymore. These lives she'd touched without ever expecting anything in return. "I was just doing my job," she said, her voice breaking. "No," David said firmly. "You went way beyond your job, and that made all the difference." 6 months passed like a dream that Ms. Patterson kept worrying she'd wake up from. She'd started her new job at the tech company, coordinating their educational outreach program. At first she'd been terrified. Her hands still shook sometimes, and she worried constantly that she'd mess something up, that they'd realize hiring her was a mistake. But the team was patient and supportive. They gave her the tools and accommodations she needed. Voice-to-text software for when her hands wouldn't cooperate. Flexible hours for doctor appointments. Understanding colleagues who saw her value rather than her limitations. And slowly, she started to believe she belonged there. The apartment she'd found was small, just a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of an older building. But it had a window that let in morning sunlight, and a kitchen where she could make her own coffee, and a bathroom with a shower that was all hers. After months of living in her car, it felt like a palace. Her children had flown in to help her move in. When they'd learned how bad things had gotten, they'd been devastated that she hadn't told them. There had been tears and apologies on both sides. Her son Tyler had taken a break from his music gigs to spend 2 weeks helping her settle in. Her daughter Rachel had set up a video call schedule so they could talk every Sunday no matter how busy life got. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you," Ms. Patterson had said to them. "I didn't want to be a burden." "Mom," Rachel had replied, holding her hands. "You're not a burden. You're our mother. Let us be there for you the way you've always been there for us." The medication Dr. Wu had prescribed was working well. The tremors weren't gone completely, but they were manageable. She could write again, though she still preferred typing. She could hold a coffee cup without worrying it would slip from her fingers. She could hug her grandchildren without her arms giving out. She was living again, not just surviving. But the biggest change wasn't in her circumstances. It was in her heart. For months after losing everything, she'd felt like a failure, like all those years of helping others had somehow been wasted because she couldn't even help herself when she needed it most. She'd felt ashamed, worthless, invisible. The reunion dinner had changed that. Seeing all those former students, hearing their stories, understanding that her life's work had meant something lasting, it had given her back something she didn't even realize she'd lost. Her sense of purpose. Now, 6 months later, she was sitting in a conference room at the tech company with David and 3 other people from the education team. They were planning a new initiative, one that Ms. Patterson had proposed in her 3rd week on the job. "So we're calling it the Teacher Support Network," she explained, pointing to the presentation she'd put together. "The idea is to identify educators who are struggling, either financially or health-wise or both, and connect them with resources before they fall through the cracks." "How would we identify them?" asked Brian, the program director. "Through schools, through social workers, through other teachers," Ms. Patterson said. "People know when their colleagues are struggling. They just often don't know how to help. We can be that bridge." David watched her present with pride. This was the Ms. Patterson he remembered. Confident, passionate, full of ideas about how to make things better. She'd found her way back to herself. "I think it's brilliant," David said. "And I think we should launch it with a story." "Your story. Show people why this matters." Ms. Patterson hesitated. She'd kept her situation relatively private, even at work. Only a few people knew the full extent of what she'd been through. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she admitted. "You don't have to decide now," Brian said gently. "But David's right. Your story is powerful. It could help a lot of people understand why programs like this are necessary." After the meeting, David and Ms. Patterson walked to the coffee shop down the street, something they'd gotten in the habit of doing once a week. It was their time to catch up, to talk about work and life and everything in between. "You know what I've been thinking about?" Ms. Patterson said as they waited in line. "That day in the restaurant. When I asked you for your leftovers. What about it? I keep wondering what would have happened if it had been someone else sitting at that table. Just a random stranger. Would they have given me the food? Would they have cared?" David thought about it. "I'd like to think they would have. Most people are kind when given the chance." "Maybe," she said, "but we'll never know. Because it was you. Out of all the restaurants in this city, all the tables, all the possible moments, it was you." They found a table by the window and sat down with their drinks. Outside, the city moved past them. People rushing to meetings, running errands, living their lives. Each person with their own struggles and triumphs, visible and invisible. "Do you believe in fate?" Ms. Patterson asked suddenly. David smiled. "I don't know. Do you?" "I used to not. I thought we made our own paths, that everything was just random chance and the choices we made." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, enjoying the warmth. "But now, I don't know. Maybe some things are meant to happen. Maybe we find each other exactly when we're supposed to. Or maybe," David said thoughtfully, "we spend our whole lives putting good things into the world, and sometimes when we need it most, those good things find their way back to us." Ms. Patterson's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "You turned out exactly how I hoped you would, you know. Kind, thoughtful, someone who helps others. I learned from the best." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the world go by. Then Ms. Patterson spoke again. "I got a message yesterday from one of my new students. Well, I guess I should call her a mentee since I'm not teaching anymore. She's 14, struggling in math, family can't afford a tutor. I've been working with her after school twice a week." "That's great," David said. "She wrote me a note. Said I was the first adult who made her feel like she was smart enough to succeed." Ms. Patterson's voice caught, "And I thought this is why. This is why all of it happened. So I could understand what it feels like to need help. So I could be more compassionate. So I could appreciate every single opportunity to make a difference in someone's life." David reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You always made a difference? Even before all this?" "Maybe, but now I understand it differently. Now I know that the people we help, They don't forget. The kindness we show, it ripples out in ways we can't imagine. You rippled back to me when I needed it most, and now I get to keep rippling forward. A month later, the local newspaper ran a feature story about Ms. Patterson and the Teacher Support Network. The headline read, "From rock bottom to reaching out, former teacher creates safety net for struggling educators." The article told her story. Not all of it, but enough. The loss, the illness, the fall into homelessness, the chance encounter with a former student, the community that rallied around her. And now, her mission to make sure other teachers didn't have to go through what she went through alone. The response was overwhelming. Teachers from across the state reached out, some asking for help, others offering to volunteer or donate. The tech company expanded the program budget. Other companies wanted to partner. Within 3 months, the Teacher Support Network had helped 23 educators facing crisis situations. Ms. Patterson's desk was covered with thank you notes. Each one a story of someone pulled back from the edge. Each one a reminder that her life's work continued to matter. On the 1-year anniversary of that day in the restaurant, David took Ms. Patterson back to Tony's Italian kitchen. The owner, who'd heard their story through the grapevine and the newspaper article, had done something special. In the corner by the window, at the table where they'd first reconnected, there was now a small plaque mounted on the wall. "The Kindness Table," it read, in honor of the reminder that the good we do never truly disappears. It waits in the universe, ready to return to us when we need it most. Below it was a small box where customers could leave money to pay for meals for people in need. The owner explained that every week he'd use the money to provide free meals to anyone who came in hungry. Ms. Patterson stood there staring at the plaque, tears streaming down her face. David stood beside her, his own eyes wet. "You know what the real miracle was?" she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "What?" "That I had the courage to ask for help. After everything, after all my pride and my shame, I was still able to say I need help. And that ask led to all of this." She gestured around them, but David knew she meant more than just the restaurant. She meant her job, her apartment, her renewed sense of purpose. The Teacher Support Network. The lives being changed because she'd been brave enough to be vulnerable. "The miracle wasn't that you helped me," she continued. "The miracle was that I didn't give up. That I kept going even when everything was falling apart. That I asked one more time for one more thing. And that ask changed everything." David nodded, understanding. "And the miracle for me was being in the right place at the right time to repay the person who changed my life." We both got our miracle that day. They sat down at the kindness table and ordered pasta just like they had a year ago. But this time they ate together. They talked about the future instead of surviving the present. They made plans for the Teacher Support Network's expansion. They laughed about old memories from 6th grade. And when they left, David noticed a young woman standing near the entrance, looking uncertain. She approached their server and spoke quietly, gesturing toward the kindness table plaque. Ms. Patterson noticed too. She caught David's eye and smiled. "The ripple continues," she said softly. "It always does," David replied. They walked out into the evening air, into a world that had seemed so dark a year ago, but now felt full of light and possibility. Not because everything was perfect, but because they'd learned the most important lesson of all. We save each other, sometimes in big ways, sometimes in small ones, and the love we give always finds its way back home.